Hello, welcome to week 4 in our course, The Theology and Ethics of Bonhoeffer. This time we have two classics that I'm sure most of you have heard before, if not read before. One is, of course, The Cost of Discipleship, Nachfolger, from the year 1937, and the other text or excerpts of the text that we're reading is Life Together, published in 1939 and based on the experience at Finkenwalde, no? The seminary of the Confessing Church. So let me give you some pointers for the reading of these two classics. Let's start with the cost of discipleship. Here you will see that the question that intrigues Bonhoeffer is the question of what does Jesus Christ want of us and from us, right? So this is, I would say, the guiding concern that will structure this treatise of Bonhoeffer. And he also wants to address the concerns of those who are put off, we could say, by the church preaching, legalism, where the human, institutional, and doctrinal elements come between them and their genuine concern for Jesus and Jesus' message, the word. So he's keeping an eye, right, about on all these people who are being put off, we could say, by the church, by their perception of this lack of seriousness, of depth, of authenticity, we could say, in the church. So here, of course, we find one of the central concepts that probably you've heard many times before, this notion of cheap grace, where basically what he is looking at is this message in Protestant churches or Lutheran churches in this case, which is a message of justification of sin without any justification of the sinner. So think about what he means by this. No, he's not trying to go back to any form of legalism or work righteousness or anything like that. I think he has a very valid, genuine, evangelical point. Luther would be in complete agreement, I think, with what Bonhoeffer is trying to address, which is the notion that we already find in the confessional books of Lutheranism, especially the Book of Concord, about the third use of the law and stuff like that, and the language that comes there. The more proper Lutheran language would be this new obedience, right, of the Christian. So what matters for Bonhoeffer is that the message of justification is not just a forensic, let's say, amnesty, yeah, but it addresses the core of our being, the core of our persons, right? Even our psyche, we could say, where there is a change, there is a transformation, never perfect in this life, of course, but where we are called to be something different, right? So this is what pertains to the notion of cheap grace. Then something, he will say very polemic, he will have these polemic statements like, only those who believe are obedient and vice versa, only those who are obedient believe. This is a style, kind of paradoxical style that you will find in Bonhoeffer. It was very much in vogue also during that time among the German-speaking theologians. You will find these type of statements also in Karl Barth, as well, and not to mention Luther himself. No, remember the freedom of a Christian. No, the paradoxical fact that we as Christians are free, we're not subject to none, to anybody, but on the other hand, the Christian is also servant, right? We are subject to the other. Um, so one aspect that I would like for you to pay attention to is something that we will see again coming up in some of the readings from his last work, right? Ethics, which is what I will call this mystical side to Bonhoeffer. We're not speaking about classical mysticism. We're speaking about Luther's mysticism, which is a kind of Christ mysticism. That is to say that for Luther, Christ was, God's gift to us, where this Christ indwells also in the believers, and we become participant of the life of Christ as well. So the point that Bonhoeffer wants to make is that when we're speaking about matters of faith, when we're speaking about the reality of faith, something happens to our ego, right? To our self. It is as though it enters in crisis and it's opened up for the first time, right? To embrace fully God in faith and to engage the neighbor in love. So as you can see, he follows, I would argue, the structure of Luther's The Freedom of a Christian to a large extent. You will also find Bonhoeffer's characteristic concern for those who are weak, for those who are in the margins. And so he's going to talk in this piece, The Cost of Discipleship. He's going to speak about this aspect of Christian life of mercy, of being merciful, where we have this irresistible love for the downtrodden, the sick, the degraded, and the oppressed. But you will see that this type of language we're going to see more and more in Bonhoeffer's writings as we progress, right, throughout the years and into the Second World War and into his active engagement, right, in the plot against Hitler. And last but not least, and in continuation with this, what I call, this mystical dimension in Bonhoeffer, pay attention to this category of being conform to the image of Christ. This may sound a little bit abstract if you read it for the first time, but bear in mind that he has this lively understanding of Christ, of faith, and therefore, the whole call, the whole adventure of being a Christian is precisely this conformation of our person, of our very identity, to this image of Christ, to the Gestalt, he would say, in German, the form of Christ. In Life Together, the second text that we're reading from 1939, he will walk us through these different moments and dimensions that pretty much are inspired by his experience, not only his, but with the community gathered in Finkenwalde. Remember the seminary of the Confessing Church in Pomerania, right? Today, that location would be in what today is Poland, because of the redrawing of boundaries after the Second World War. But here, so the structure or the elements that he will be talking about is, first of all, the reality of community, Uh, then how is the day together in this community? Um, what it means also to be alone, and this is a very interesting uh, aspects or emphasis that you will find in this reading. The importance of intercession, yes, in prayer, service to one another, and the Lord's Supper, the sacramental moment in the life of the community. You have to bear in mind, however, that even though this text of Bonhoeffer and even the experience in Finkenwalde was very much criticized by many Lutherans and Protestants in general, they had the suspicion that it was too monastic, too legalistic, and so on. You have to bear in mind that at no point Bonhoeffer is saying that this is the only way of being Christian community or being a Christian, right? Is to live only in this type of community. No, he's reflecting, he's given a theological, we could say, um, dimension to this profound experience that they had together for almost 2 years. Um, so you will find here again some um, of the same themes that you saw before. Um, and for example, the one pertaining to this, again, this mystical dimension that I call this Christ mysticism in Bonhoeffer, where we see that now, Christ unlocks the I, the power of the ego, yes, and open us to God and the neighbor. Again, like repeating um, the basic structure of Luther's definition of what Christianity is all about. No, this twofold movement that takes place in the believer, and where we are transformed when our identity start to mutate, we could say, even though we always remain, of course, creatures. Not only we always remain creatures, this is the only way in which we can really be creatures, really be human. Um, so he will also speak about uh, the exclusion of the weak and the insignificant, this um, attitude toward neighbors that we despise is an exclusion of Christ himself. So you will see here, um, for example, the notion that appears in Matthew 25, right? This Christ that comes to us, meet us in the midst of our ordinary life, through the faces, the bodies, the lives of those who have lived in the margins, who suffer persecution, hunger, thirst, uh, and so on. So I think that with these elements, you have enough pointers. The texts are so rich, in many points so polemical, that you will have, I'm sure, plenty to talk about during this week. So all the best with the reading and your posting.